Okay, so I will go ahead and get started as I know people are streaming from Facebook Live and still coming in to the Zoom. And it is always my pleasure to be here with beloved community on Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. That is the time that the Howard University School of Divinity gathers for chapel, for conversation, for worship. And we are so thankful to be here in the midst of this series that we have begun, which I will talk about in just one moment, as well as welcome our guests. I will take a little bit of decanal privilege because as people are streaming in and joining us, to share, it is a difficult time. It is a very difficult time for me tonight. I imagine for many of you all, as we were greeted with the news about the indictments in the Breonna Taylor killing and finding out, as we know in this country, that our justice system is neither just nor does it ever take into the fullness of the consideration of Black humanity. I got to tell you all, it is a hard, hard blow for me. It is not because I expected something different. You're never, ever surprised. But when you find out that even at a legal level, that shooting into a wall might be the thing that gets you indicted, but the actual shooting 5 bullets into a living, breathing creation of God doesn't seem to carry in a consequence. And so as a Black woman, as a mother, as a dean, as a teacher, as a person of faith, I am sitting with this news, and it is a difficult news for us to bear. Normally, I would open us up with some words of prayer, but my prayer is simply a lament from the Psalm, which is, "How long, O God?" And as we sit with the lament, as we sit with that moment, we join as an institution, a historically Black theological institution, unapologetically Black in its orientation, proud for 150 years to continue the legacy of Benjamin Elijah Mays and Howard Thurman, and to do the work that we do. It is a pleasure and a privilege. But our hearts right now are with Breonna Taylor's family, all of the people in Louisville who have taken to the streets and are marching, the people here in Washington, D.C., who have already gathered at Black Lives Matter Plaza, and all of you who I know have been closely following this case. So that is my prayer tonight, that we really remain people of justice, even when justice so often seems denied. So I want to just welcome our guests to this continuing series that we are calling The First 5 Years. We have invited senior pastors who are in their first 5 years of their senior pastor ministry to have conversations with the Howard University School of Divinity. Why the first 5 years? Well, it's simple. Child development experts tell us that the first 5 years of your life, there is more intellectual, physical, emotional, and spiritual growth in those first 5 years than if you lived another 80 years. Well, we have the theologians and the pastoral care specialists who also assure us that the first 5 years of senior pastoring are the most critical of someone's vocational calling, that when you take on the mantle of senior leadership, those first 5 years are the most critical, even if you remain a pastor or a clergy leader or a chaplain for the rest of your life. I just completed 3 years as dean. I have learned more in 3 years as dean than I have in the almost 25 years of my academic schooling. So there is something about the first 5 years. So I want to welcome tonight 2 guests. They're very, very special guests, the Reverend Dr. Willie Francois. I'll let him introduce himself and say a few words when I turn this over to Reverend Peterman. I just happen to mention, though, that he is the pastor of one of our student students, one of our current students, one of our amazing students, if I can just put a little plug in, because she is in my class. And so if whatever she is getting from that church shows up in my class on Friday, then that is a very special place that you are pastoring. And we thank you for your presence here tonight. And I would also like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Sammy Dowd. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Atlanta last year. I had the pleasure of working with him a little bit, and I am so honored that the two of them are joining us in what is certain to be a very interesting conversation. So Reverend Peterman, I turn the floor over to you and to our two guests. And you are muted, so there you go.
Good evening, everyone. Certainly we don't take it for granted. Another opportunity to gather as a community, to have some conversations about ministry in the first 5 years. Our first guest this evening, as the Dean has already introduced him, is the Reverend Willie Francois, who is a native of Galveston, Texas, a graduate of Morehouse College and Harvard Divinity School, and he recently completed his Doctor of Ministry degree at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. Also with us is the pastor of the Pleasant Grove Baptist Church in Marietta, Georgia, the Reverend Sammy Dowd, who was a graduate of North Carolina A&T and the University of Pittsburgh, and he also completed his theological degree at Peterman University and Payne Theological Seminary. We're so grateful tonight to have this conversation, and our conversation last week focused on candidating and pastoral transition. And this evening, we're going to talk a little bit about church budget, finance, and church growth. Those are three areas that many of us who have sought out to become ministers of the gospel can say that we weren't necessarily trained to do the work of budgeting and developing a financial model for churches when we arrived at those particular spaces. So hopefully tonight this conversation is enriching. And I just want to start off by asking Willie and Sammy, or what should I call you, Dr. Francois and Dr. Dowd, if you could just give us some insight on what is the process for budgeting and the model that is used at your church. What did you walk into, and what have you created since you've been there, and how did that adapt? Just give us some groundwork, some foundational information about maybe what you walked into on day one of your pastorates. I think you're both muted. Sammy, I think you're muted.
Okay, there we go. Good evening. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight. I'm honored by the opportunity. I'll preface my remarks by saying I pastor a traditional missionary Black Baptist church in the South.
My.
And so I walked into our budgeting process, could be a 3 or 4 hour meeting, where literally the church conference, as we call it, would go line by line through the entire budget. And comments from the floor could range from, well, X ministry got more than my ministry, and I don't think we ought to pay so-and-so that because they won't make my copies for me when I call the office. So that was the nature of what I walked into, and they were very contentious meetings. And I came in initially and said, if we can't conduct God's business as though we are in God's house, then we're going to have to find a different process and way of doing this. Our process now looks as though our budget is an outgrowth of vision, right? Because without a vision, we don't know what structure we need to set up. We don't understand where we need to direct and divert funds to ensure that we're moving towards the vision that God has given our church. So our governing documents call for our church conference, which is our church body, electing representatives to a budget committee. That budget committee then sits with the church's leadership team and goes through the process of developing a budget in conjunction with our church business administrator. That budget is then presented at a high level to our congregation in terms of income, terms of revenue rather and expenses, and we go through an approval process. But the driving force behind that entire process is what is the vision that God has given our church? More specifically, what objectives are we looking to accomplish in the ensuing year? And from that, we develop a budget, we develop a plan for how we spend our resources. And I always remind our congregation that for a church, a budget is a faith document. We are saying, based on everything, all of the information available to us, this is what we believe we can raise over the course of the year. But as I tell my folks each and every week, we raise our budget every week. So we there's also this understanding of if we're concerned about expenses of the church, we have to be just as concerned about our commitment to resourcing, to investing in the local church. So I hope that's a fair overview of our process.
Willie, what did you walk into on day one, and how have things either stayed the same or transformed?
Yeah, so when I walked into our process about 4.5 years ago, the financial area was the most green part of my pastoral experience of my pastoral docket. It's the area where I had the least amount of concern and had the least amount of concern my first day as pastor, and it was the area that I had the least amount of competency. And I say concern because, I served in 2 mega ministries, 2 churches, one in Houston, one in New York, where I was not a part of the budgeting process at all. And if I needed money, the money was there for me to do the kind of programming work that I wanted to do. And so coming into a space where the budget really lives and dies on the quality of Sunday morning engagement. Sunday morning at our church, and I'm sure it's the same for most of our churches, is the most dynamic fundraising day. Unfortunately, and I do say unfortunately, I am the chief fundraiser in our congregation, and it took me a few months to really realize that those numbers that I was getting Sunday afternoon after we hand count the experience, because we didn't have online giving at all. Then after we hand count what was put in a tray is that what happens in that tray, what happens in that Sunday morning experience actually determines what we're able to do outside of the sanctuary. And so it honestly took me 3 months to really embrace that this was a fundamental part of what I came to do as an executive, and not just as a kind of caregiver and person who journeys alongside people. So that's how I entered. Our process was not really defined. We kind of understood that we had a cash-based budget. Whatever was raised was what was able to be spent, and that's kind of how it was introduced to me. But in the middle of my first year, we actually had a budget meeting, and we had a budget meeting, and I do not know to what extent my predecessor was involved in this in that kind of process, because I didn't enter into a process. I entered into an experience that was based on, Pastor, we ain't got it, or Pastor, let's see where we can find it. That was literally the financial conversations we were having. And so we had, like, in the middle of the year, because I came in December, by July, we had a budget meeting, a preliminary budget meeting, where we had to hear the lines. This is what we spend on salaries. This is what we spend on building and grounds. This is what we spend on benevolence. And this is what we spend on mortgage. And we had to create that kind of a structured way of thinking about what comes in and what goes out. So I mean, and it's not an elaborate process, but it is a process that is deeply contingent upon what the vision is for that year. What do I want to achieve? What do we want to achieve as a community this year, as a community of faith this year, and trying to figure out how to add dollars and cents to that. And as Dr. Dowd just said, you know, our budget is a faith document because we are believing we can have this type of income to achieve this kind of output. So this kind of income output dynamic is very real, and it's deeply connected to faith. But the other part is I see it as a faith document, and similarly, I see it as a sort of theoethical document as well, that where we spend our money as a congregation actually tells the community and tells us what we believe about God and what our ecclesiology is. And so I always think if we really want to know what a church's understanding, a self-conception is, if we really want to understand what this community's ecclesiological commitments are, you go to that budget. And I've talked about this with our trustees and talked about this with our congregation, is that, you know, there has to be money set up, you know, before the year starts, that automatically goes out into the streets, that automatically hits the ground. And so right now, our percentages, we think about 10% of our, we commit to about 10% of our budget going toward community engagement, social justice, and you know, missions, you know, whatever those are these days. But because I understand the budget as a theoethical document, like it's a faith document because we've got to raise it, but it also communicates what we believe about God, what our values are, what we are committed to as a faith community, as people who say we're interested in the work of Jesus. And so it has been a struggle, even to this day, on making that leap to ensure setting aside resources that go into the community, resources that we don't touch for anything that is not community development, social justice, or missions, however we talk about that. So that was really that's really what our process looks like at this point. Now, I want to be clear, this is a success that we've had, and a reason why our budget was so cash-based, why it was, why I ran into those resistance walls my first couple of years as pastors, because for the 7 years before I became the pastor, we were running in the red significantly every single year. It was my first year as pastor that we were able, that was the first time we were in the black for, at the end of the year, as a congregation in almost a decade. I share this broadly. The year 2015, the year before I got there, we ended the year, and this is the year before I got there, but we ended the year $149,000 in the red, right? And so, I don't fully know why that is. I honestly don't know how we overcame that kind of leap within a year, because I still just experiment with what it means to be a pastor. But I came into a process where we lived with a scarcity mentality that really put a lot of restraints on what we understood ministry to be.
Sammy, what are the questions that somebody who's been called to pastor a church, what are the questions that person needs to be asking on day one regarding budget? Willie talked about the pastor as fundraiser. And I think we know the pastor as priest and prophet, but often we don't know what questions we should be asking on day one. We also know, all of us know of churches where the pastor is not even involved in the budget process. So what would you say are the questions that a pastor should be asking on day one, and then go into what does it look like for that person to become the chief fundraiser for the congregation?
Well, I will say I agree with Willie 100%. You are the chief fundraiser. You will oftentimes hear preachers who share very candidly that Sundays that they are out on vacation or preaching for others, there's a financial impact to that. Right? So you are oftentimes basing decisions on requesting engagements on, can I afford to be out of my pulpit that week? And we are, and I think that's important because we have this conversation about, oh, pastors need to take care of themselves. They need to take breaks. You know, pastor, go away. We love you. Go enjoy yourself. Right. But then I go away. Y'all don't show up for church. And there's a $12,000 difference in what was raised that week. And then we wonder what creates this conundrum where pastors feel like, I can't be out of the pulpit. There's a financial impact to that. So you are the chief fundraiser. This is an aside. I would encourage you to structure your worship experiences where you raise the offering before you preach, because you want to make sure that they have given so that if you bomb, your giving isn't depending on the fact that you bombed that week, right? That's just, y'all, that's just being real. Now, questions that I would encourage you asking before you walk in the door, whether you are involved in your church's budgeting process, depending on what that looks like in your local congregation. Dr. Ralph West Sr., who's one of my doctoral advisors, says, you're not just responsible for pastoring people, you're also responsible for pastoring dollars. And so you need to make sure that you are crystal clear on the church's budgeting process, the church's budget. What does that document look like? Because to Willie's point, it communicates priorities. It communicates what they're committed to. It communicates what that congregation values. It communicates also how a church sees themselves and how they are preparing, projecting, planning for the future. You need to be aware of that. You need to have a copy of that church's constitution and bylaws in your hand, so that you understand what processes, what barriers, what walls of resistance you will hit as you begin to put things in place that are going to cost money. Because one of the things that I had to learn was all of the ideas and the vision I had coming in as pastor, there was a dollar amount attached to each and every one of them, period. Oh, we need the live stream, there's a dollar amount attached to that. Oh, we need to do X and Y with the sound, there's a dollar amount attached to that. God has given me a vision for this transformative community outreach program. There's a dollar amount attached to that. And so you need to understand that as a new pastor coming in the door, many of your ideas are going to cause the church to spend more money than they have ever been accustomed to spending before in those areas. But you also then have to step back and say, God, I need you to resource, to provide in a way like you've never provided before, because you also understand that you're going to raise more money than you've ever raised before, right? Fresh vision, tapping into, getting in God's face as pastor, hearing from God how God wants you to move forward. There is going to be a fresh wave of energy that comes through, and that wave of energy is going to be accompanied by dollars. It is our prayer in Jesus's name, right? But what ends up happening is, and Willie, bro, you hit it. You hit the nail on the head. There is a poverty mentality that exists that you are oftentimes fighting. And I'm not just talking about in rural settings. Even with folks that we would consider silk stocking, there's oftentimes this poverty mentality of, well, why are we spending money here? I mean, he raising the money, she's raising the money, but they spending all of it. Hold on, wait a minute. Right. And then you have to start to have conversations with people. Let's talk about this. Yeah, you spending the money. Okay, we need a website that doesn't freeze when people log on to it. And a quality website isn't cheap. Right. We need sound. We need staff that knows how to do more than turn the volume up and down on the sound system. That requires dollars. Okay. So you have to understand that. But you also have to be prepared to accept the reality that every line item has a story for which you are unaware. Mm. Every line item has a story for which you are unaware. I told y'all I pastor in Marietta, Georgia, suburbs of Atlanta. And when I got there, y'all, we ate every event, every program we were eating. And I mean, y'all, I'm not talking about like chicken wings, meatballs. I'm talking about fried chicken, fried turkey, dressing, green beans, potato salad. I mean, full Thanksgiving spreads. And I'm like, this is good food, but why do we eat at everything? So I literally had our church business administrator pull the amount of money we spent on food in the 6 months prior to my arrival, because I arrived at my church in June of 2017. And at one of our meetings preparing for the budget for the next fiscal year, I said, y'all, this is how much money we've spent in food. What? And somebody literally said, well, Pastor, give me an example of what you mean when you say this is how much money we spent on food. This is how much money tens of thousands of dollars we've spent just on feeding each other. No expansion of community outreach, No expansion of children and youth programming, no expansion of technological infrastructure. We've spent that money just feeding each other. And so when you start to raise those level of very factual realities to people, everybody has an opinion, but we're not entitled to our own facts. Here's the reality of what we are spending and what we are spending it on. And when you start to raise that for people and you ask them, now, what difference is this making in the life of our church and in the life of the community in which we sit and are called to serve?
So I want to pose this question to Willie. I started ministry in New York, and one of the things I learned day one in Brooklyn was how valuable property was, and how important it was for churches to own property, and also the burden of property. Being in Brooklyn and seeing what was going on there, seeing what was going on in Harlem, the Abyssinian Development Corporation, so many different churches who were acquiring property, and even churches who had property and didn't know what to do with property. Can you talk a little bit about the role of real estate in the Black church, the importance of it, and also where we go wrong sometimes and how we can better leverage the property that we own or desire to buy?
Yeah, so I think it's true for many Black congregations. I don't want to overstate it, but it's true for many Black congregations that we're usually property rich and we're cash poor. A lot of us have awesome buildings, and those buildings, stewarding those buildings are significant weights, significant, burdens even, but particularly the kind of weight that they put on our budgets, the weight they put on the congregation is real, right? And I think every congregation has to be honest when they're thinking about, when they're in the, thinking about real estate possibilities, whether really the cost and whether the benefits of selling and keeping, because it's different from every congregation. In Southern New Jersey, I don't live with the kind of economic pressures that exist in hyper gentrifying areas like Harlem. And I don't know what the pressures are to say, let's pump $1 million into a building that is falling apart, possibly in repair, or do we trust a developer who says that they can get us X amount of millions and put our building at the bottom of a condo, right? Of a high rise, right? I don't know what it means to live with those kind of pressures, so I don't want to speak too cavalier about them. But what I do know for sure is that it's really hard. It's harder to gentrify communities where Black people own things, right? And part of the reason we've been able to be supplanted and displaced, right? We live under the theatrics of terror, of capitalism, of the myth of urban renewal, is because most of our communities, the only things that we own are like churches. It is, I think if you pull Black churches together, you have probably some of the greatest, strongest real estate in the country, right? Because, churches are one of the few things that we own. And so I really don't know. I really don't know that pressure that exists of trying to maintain a building that has slipped into repair in the middle of a crisis where churches are graying and shrinking. And when churches gray and shrink, that means budgets also shrink, and that there are pastors and there are boards that had to make decisions to rest free of their properties because of those very real economic challenges, those very real fiscal restraints that aren't going to be remedied because the pastor decides to put on skinny jeans and wear cardigans, right? There are a lot of churches, unfortunately, that will not survive this post-COVID reality, and they're going to have to make hard decisions. And some of them will have young pastors, young in tenure, that will have to make decisions on whether or not to sell buildings or whether or not to keep buildings. My recommendation is that that's a decision that should be made as a congregation. It shouldn't just be made by somebody at the top or by some plutocratic group in the church, because we do know that a lot of decisions are made by these plutocratic groups, those who have the most money or who contribute the most. But it should be a church-wide form of discernment, and it should also be a process where you have very competent counsel, where you have a lawyer on the front end, where you have your own real estate consultation consultant on the front end, because there's so many churches, particularly in my beloved Harlem, that have been scammed out of their sacred space. They've been scammed out of what has been a fulcrum of their communal life, and some of it happened because of decisions being made by small insular groups of people, and decisions being made without serious legal and real estate counsel. Obviously, having property is real in this country. That's what it means to be owner. It's a part of the American dream, right? To own. So at no point would I say, no, yes, just sell and get the money. But at the other time, on the other hand, I also understand the deep burden that exists on communities of faith in hyper gentrifying areas, that it's hard to see how you survive in that particular community. But I think if you have a plan, and if you have the right external consultation, you don't need to use the lawyer that's in your church. You don't need to use the real estate investor or real estate professional in your church. Get external counsel on this. People who are not deeply invested in it as we are, and move through that process with great care and with great concern.
So that was a question on my list. And I saw Sammy clapping. Let's talk about, how do you get the right team around the table? What did you do? We all know that trustee who's been serving for far too long. We all know that church administrator who may not be skilled to actually oversee the church's finances in 2020 post-COVID. How did you, and maybe you're still doing this, how do you get the right team in place to move the church forward financially?
I think that varies. I think, in all honesty, that varies from congregation to congregation. I am blessed and have been fortunate that I've had a phenomenal team that was in place prior to my arrival. And I'm grateful to God for my deacon chair, my trustee chair, our church business administrator. They're phenomenal. And they were in place prior to my arrival. So I can't, in a responsible way, speak to how do you sit folks down that have been there forever, but they can barely count. So I won't attempt to speak to that. What I will say is that, and it's interesting because I see the question is kind of happening here in the chat. I think that pandemic, shutdown, quarantine is making us reevaluate finances and budgets in ways that we have not heretofore had to. For some churches, COVID has been a blessing because it has allowed leadership to make significant investments that needed to be made without the fights that would have existed prior to COVID, right? Putting up a screen in a church or buying a camera is an all-out war for some pastors. But when that's all you have, it's a lot harder to fight with it, right? And so I think that has been helpful in some regards. As I talk to colleagues and friends across the country, we are all shouting and celebrating that in some way our expenses have been reduced, or we have been able to redirect expenses, if that makes sense. I would say for our congregation, we have been able to redirect expenses. We were able to expand our food distribution efforts. We were able to figure out how we shore up benevolence operations. We were able to make significant investments in our broadcast each week so that that is a high quality experience that keeps you connected, informed, and engaged, because that's still the chief hour I have to raise the resources that we need. It's created space and opportunity for us to make some of the capital investments in our church that we've needed to make without figuring out who we fight, who we move, who we cancel to make that happen. And so I think that as we are experiencing a segment and population of churches that are suffering through pandemic and having to make significant decisions, I think crises also presents opportunity. And so there's an opportunity that exists to evaluate who we are and what we do and why we do it and how we do it, and to make different decisions. And I'll be honest with you, there's some folks that we've seen giving now that weren't giving prior to COVID. There's something about crises that reminds you that you are not operating in your own strength, in your own might, and in your own power. And it has forced people, I think, to kind of reorient thinking. And some folks are now investing in communities of faith that perhaps may not have done so before. And communities of faith are now more accessible, right? We're more accessible places that were not streaming, that were not offering a virtual presence, our church included. Prior to this, we are now working on it with intentionality every week to offer a high quality experience. And so I think that as we look at this continuing conversation, new paradigms are being laid for budgeting process, right? There was some staff I was planning to hire this year that there was a hold put on that. And COVID now has made me say, I don't know that I need it. I need that position. I really should be redirecting energy, attention, and resources in certain areas and in specific areas that pandemic has lifted to the surface for us, that we now recognize we cannot walk back from, but we have to figure out how we incorporate and integrate these into what is our next normal. I am not subscribing to the new normal. I'm calling it the next normal, because 7 or 8 months from now, there'll be something else in culture and life in society that pops up that shifts the paradigm for what it means to do ministry in this contemporary culture that we've got to respond to and walk with. And so someone asks, and Dean Pierce asks, are people still giving at pre-COVID levels? I hope none of my members are watching this. Praise the Lord, some folk are giving better than pre-COVID levels. Right. But I know that's not everyone's testimony, but I'm grateful to God that God has continued to favor our congregation even in this moment, so that we could expand the footprint of who we are and what we do in a way that speaks to the future, that speaks to what we hope to be, that speaks to who the best of who we are seeking to become. And it has pulled us outside of the walls. So we're not just spending money on each other and what happens in our building. We're now being forced to think about how we spend resources and funds in a way that impacts people who are not stepping foot in our building and who we've never been connected to before. So we have folks that are joining our congregation each week that don't even live in the state of Georgia, which means that we've now got to figure out from a budgeting resource standpoint, how do we minister to and care for folks who don't live even in our state, in our local area, and what it means and what impact, I should say, that is having on finances, resources, and things of that nature. And when folks are away, hopefully they are quieter and they behave better. So it gives you an opportunity to really make some financial headway that's critically important as we think about what post-COVID church looks like. And it's interesting because a friend and I are starting a Doctor of Ministry cohort at Payne Theological Seminary in January, so that practitioners, ministry practitioners, can sit and evaluate what it means to renew and grow local congregations in a post-pandemic world.
Sammy, I'm taking a question from the chat, and feel free, Sammy or Willie, to take this. Talk a little bit about trend analysis. One of the things that COVID has even forced me to do in my service at my own congregation is to begin looking at some data analysis. What role do you think data analysis should play in the post-COVID church? And Lord knows, I don't know that we've ever been serious in the Black church about looking at data analysis. So what role do you think that plays? Also, I want to encourage folks to put questions in the chat, either on Facebook or in our Zoom chat. Feel free to ask them questions so that our guests tonight can answer them.
Well, one, I think that the decision to reopen has to be connected to data, connected to numbers, and so I think that any decisions that we're making that aren't connected to numbers, probably need to be reassessed, probably need to be updated so that we can continue to upgrade the kind of work that we're doing. What is very clear is that this is probably a 5 to 7 year economic recovery that we're going to be looking at, and that recovery, and many people are seeing it right now, has not started, right? And we have to be clear, the economic recovery has not started. And I think that the numbers, data, can help us measure what we can, to help us measure how frivolous we can be. Right, because we actually are communities, and these are churches across ethnic and racial lines that can tend to be so self-serving, can tend to be so insular, can tend to be these communities rooted in me. That I think that the way the finances may trend because of this economic reality that will be with us for a little while, I think requires us to cut out as much of, to lean our budgets in ways that we haven't thought to do in the past, to lean our budgets in ways that begin to honor what I said earlier, the kind of ecclesiological values that we have, right? That honor of what we say we believe in, like what things are mission critical and what things do we do just because we have done them in the past. And so I think that if we're going to be honest about looking at the trends and honoring how the flow of finances look across churches, how the flow of finances look in other sectors, how the flow of nonprofit giving looks, I think it can help us measure how frivolous we can be and begin to redirect funds and things that we think matter. I think that the data will also help us understand what it means to be relevant. And when I'm talking about relevant, I'm not talking about being cool or being hip, but I'm talking about the kind of work that is actually life expanding, the kind of work that actually goes to transform communities. Because when I think about relevant ministry, I'm thinking about ministry that's contextually intelligent, right? And so hopefully the trend, these numbers, if we start paying attention to data, start paying attention to numbers, that it will allow us to be more contextually intelligent and not just traditionalistically bound to what we have done in the past, because contextual intelligence will tell us where people are. Contextual intelligence tells us where people's sufferings are concentrated. Contextual intelligence will tell us what people are looking for in terms of congregational life. Contextual intelligence will tell us what kind of messages actually speak to the fullness of the human experience. Contextual intelligence will tell us what kind of community development projects are important, because it may be true that our communities don't need another clothing bank. Our communities may not even need another soup kitchen, right? But it's allowing the trends, and not just the trends of where churches are, but the trends that are happening in communities, the trends that are happening in states, the trends that are happening in other sectors of our economy, which will help us to innovate which will help us to determine the kind of innovations and disruptions that churches need to be in this particular moment. So it is my hope that we're paying attention to the numbers, and paying attention to the numbers must start with, what does it mean to re-enter into assembled life, right? What does it mean to re-enter into gathered space? Because, those numbers dictate that several people have opened up too soon without the proper precautions, without the proper protocols in place. And so we really have to lean into the numbers, because now, probably more than any other time before, there are too many lives that are literally hanging on the decisions, like swinging on the decisions that congregations are making about reentry and making about communal investments. And hopefully numbers will help us do that.
Yeah. Well, certainly we want to thank both of you for contributing tonight. This has been such a rich conversation, one that we don't actually have often enough, but one that is so important to the vitality of our congregations. My final question is, when you think about your first 5 years in ministry, when you think about this journey, what was one of the early mistakes that you made in terms of budgeting and finances that you have learned from, and that you would give our students some insight on tonight before we close?
I would say, grateful, again, as I mentioned earlier, for the team that has been around me from the beginning of my pastorate at Pleasant Grove, that I don't have the testimony of I made some really terrible financial decisions or budgeting decisions. If I would say anything as it relates to budgeting and finance and spending, is my mistake would probably have been underestimating the value of communication. Right. It was oftentimes, Pastor, we see what you're doing. We don't mind it, but I mean, just tell us what's going on. All right. That's typically the response that was received. And I think what folks were saying is, we see the investments that are being made. Somewhere in our hearts and our minds, we know the investments are necessary, but it was really a cry to be included in the process of what transformation looks like. And I think oftentimes, I was 30 years old when I began my pastorate. Oftentimes, you come in young, energetic, full of ideas, full of creativity, too self-assured and confident at times, and you take off running with the realization that you have not trained those that you have now been called to serve and lead to run with you. And so when you take off running, it alienates a demographic of people who say, I want to run with you, but I've not been given the opportunity to do so. Not out of a lack of desire, but out of a lack of, I would say, sheer capacity. Talk to me more about what God is saying to you that God wants to do in our community of faith. How can we be a part of that, and really helping people to understand their seat on the bus beyond just financing it? How can they be a part of it? How can they be a part of the journey? And how can they become, church is still a place where they want to invest in the pastor, and they want to see the pastor succeed in a healthy environment, want to see the pastor succeed because they understand the pastor's success is their success, is the church's success, is the community's success. But make sure that you're intentional in taking people on that journey with you. And don't take it personally. They don't know you well enough and haven't known you long enough for it to be a personal attack. Oftentimes, you are simply the new face of things that have been brewing for a while. And one of the questions I know that folks ask, I don't have experience with launching or planting a church, but if you're launching, understand that every move you make is setting precedent for what will be the organization's culture, spirit, focus, vision as you move forward. And so for those that are pursuing various levels of their educational journey, trust God throughout the process, trust the process, and know that the words are true, that it all indeed does work together, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. Thank you for the opportunity to join you tonight.
Willie?
Yeah, I think that for those of us who are going into pastoral, who are going into senior pastoral ministry or congregational staff ministry in any way, I think that it's important to spend the first 6 months as a kind of pastoral ethnographic practice, right? That you should see yourself as collecting the stories of the congregation. You should see yourself, so the pastor as storyteller, but also the pastor as story receiver, because there is a deep history of why those chairs are in the pulpit the way they are in the pulpit. There's a deep history about why that same, mother sits in that particular seat. There's a history around why deacon so-and-so does something. So see the pastoral work as an ethnographic journey, is that you are collecting the stories of that community to learn who that community is as a collective, by collecting those various stories. And that could be helpful when you start to think about some of these budgetary shifts that you may have to make. I did this in my own pastorate. I actually was not afraid to start renovating things when I got there. And I'm not talking about physical renovation. I'm talking about the renovation of ideas, the renovation of programs, right? The renovation of staff, right? Starting to change the staff because, I believe I spent the time listening, learning, journeying with people. But it's also, to be clear, that many of us will end up in churches that are on triage. These churches, they need swift innovation and repair, and they need it quickly. But it's just a matter of how you go about doing that. And one of the practices I think is helpful is what is your pedagogical model like, right? Are you interested in teaching? Don't, as Dr. Dowd said, don't make major changes, and almost any change could be major to an outsider when you're an outsider. I want to be clear about that. And they do see you as an outsider when you get there, even though you are the pastor, right? But to understand is that you have an obligation to teach toward the change, right? So seeing every Bible study, seeing every small group, seeing some sermons as opportunities to start planting seeds for where you want the community to go, and how you want to move the community in that direction. So teaching is going to be very important. And the last thing that I think is going to be really important for those of us who are doing ministry in a post-pandemic world, is that we have to accept the fact that our communities of faith are what Martha Simmons called bivocal, is that we're now speaking in two languages. We're in person, but we're also online, and figuring out how do you tell the story to your congregation of the value of remaining online, even as you are back in person. One easy way to do that is by telling the story of the finances. One of the gifts of our time during this pandemic has been that our finances have increased, because it has allowed us to be exposed to more people across the country, across the world, and even in our local area. But beginning to see your work, that you need excellence in person, but you also need excellence online. You need, and particularly as it relates to Sunday mornings and Bible study experiences, is that these are now transformative productions, that life-giving productions, and you have to see it in that way without allowing the kind of baggage and the assumptions of what productionism feels like as inauthentic, as showy, right? You got to work through that to figure out, how do I develop an authentic production that is life-giving and transforming? Because that online world, actually, they have so many options that they can scroll by, click by, download through, that you have to see that you have to be invested in the quality of that online experience, and talk about how finances are connected to that online experience. One of the great things that happened to us, and I'm done, Doc. One of the greatest things that happened to us was that, you know, we actually had some local folk who were watching, who had never been to our church, who will probably never step into our church, who are connected to our local Democratic Party. And this woman saw our worship experience and sent an email to the entire Democratic club of Atlantic County. Is like, we need to invest money into Mount Zion, right? That wouldn't have happened if we didn't have an experience online that was worth tuning into, you know, from start to finish, or whatever part they caught us in. And so seeing our communities as bivocal, as online and offline, and making sure that both of those experiences have an investment that indicate that the people who are watching are as important as the people who are in the pews, and the people who are in the pews are just as important as the people who are watching from the screen, I think is going to be really important for how we maintain the financial health of Black churches.
That is awesome. I just, first of all, I want to thank our two guests, because I want to thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. These are the kinds of conversations that seminaries and divinity schools and places where people who are being trained must have, and they often do not have them. And so that is part of why we've convened this series. And I thank you both, because you all have shared some gems. And I was taking some notes even as you all were speaking. So I want to thank you for being here with the Howard University School of Divinity tonight. I want to thank you for your honesty and your vulnerability. And we want to simply pray God's blessings on both of your ministries, which I know are doing transformative work during an era that is difficult. It is not an easy time for churches, for pastors, for ministries. So thank you so much. To beloved community, the HUSD family, thank you for joining us. You know, we are here every Wednesday at 5:30 on Facebook Live and also on Zoom. Please know that we will continue our series as planned, and you receive the messages about that every Monday when you receive the word from the dean. I want to close us out in prayer. I start at the top of the hour with my heartfelt sorrow and lament about Breonna Taylor. So that is certainly part of my prayer tonight. I want you to keep in prayer our alumna, Angela Sims, Dr. Angela Sims, who is being inaugurated as president of the Colgate Rochester Crozer Seminary. And we join in congratulations for the mighty things that God is doing in her life. And we are just praying for all of the people who are being impacted by the pandemic, the multiple pandemics in which we often find ourselves. So let me end with just this word of prayer. Oh God, you are a God of justice. So God, we come to you tonight to thank you for who you are, for the gifts that you have given us, for that which you have sown into us. God, we thank you for these institutions that are represented, including the Howard University School of Divinity. Thank you for this place, for 150 years of its service. God, tonight we ask your blessings upon our guests who came and shared so willingly with us, their ministries, their congregations, their families. We know that this work is not easy, and they are making sacrifices to do so. May there have been something said tonight that encouraged someone's spirit, pressed them, convicted them, helped them to see a way forward. God, we simply ask that you just guide us as a nation in a time of so much turmoil, in a time of so much wickedness and evil in the land. God, we stand against the forces and the powers and the principalities that deny our humanity, that deny our dignity, that deny that we were made in your image and your likeness. We affirm with the writer that no weapon formed against us shall prosper, even as we deal with the blows of the multiple weapons that come against us. God, we surrender all of our needs and desires and hopes and dreams and prayers to you, oh God, for we know that you are able. I pray this prayer in the matchless name of Jesus. Amen and amen. Thank you, HUSD family. We will see you here next Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Thank you so much for our guests. Thank you, Reverend Peterman. Next week, join us as we're talking about the interim pastor, and our own double alumna will be the host, Reverend Dr. Paula Hall. So God bless you all and have a wonderful night.